Okay, good afternoon, all of you. Good afternoon, good morning to all of whom are following this presentation, live streamed all over the world. My name is Jean-Denis. I'm Africa Program Officer at the International Energy Agency. And it's my real pleasure here to be with you and with our colleagues who will be presenting insights on the recently launched World Energy Outlook of the International Energy Agency 2023. This event is being organized in collaboration with the Nordic Energy Research. We will start with a brief presentation by the IEA's Chief Economist, Mr. Tim Gould, who will go through the main takeaways of the World Energy Outlook 2023 that was launched end of October. And following this, we will have a panel discussion where panelists will share insights from their respective countries and organizations on the possible ways forward and how to achieve the recommendations from the World Energy Outlook. And then we will end the session opening the floor to some questions from the audience. We will also be honored by the presence of the Swedish Minister of Energy as well as the IEA Executive Director, who will be providing closing remarks. Without further ado, I would like to invite my colleague Tim Gould to the floor for the presentation of the key findings from the WEO 2023.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Cyrine, and greetings to all of you for this discussion. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes to run through some of the key findings from our World Energy Outlook, and then I am very grateful to Jean-Denis, to Jason, to Thiago, who are going to provide some expert comment, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing their views as ever. As I hope some of you are aware, the World Energy Outlook is our annual attempt to try and make sense of developments in the energy sector, think through what today's policy settings, today's market settings, today's technology momentum might mean for developments in the energy sector through to 2050, and what that tells us about the risks that we face. And we're in a fragile moment in the global energy system. I mean, in global energy markets, we've come through a very difficult period in the last few years, but developments, there's a lot of geopolitical tensions. Economic issues are not necessarily favorable for the sorts of things that we would like to see in the energy sector. High interest rates, they mitigate against some of the changes that we would like to see. There's problems of indebtedness in many parts of the world, including in key emerging developing economies. So the starting point is a complex one. And we were also very conscious of the fact that when we were putting this together, instability in the Middle East, which could also spill over into energy markets. So we thought that we would at least provide a perspective looking back on how far have we come in the 50 years since the first oil shock. And the first oil shock, I'm sure many of you will remember, is also the shock that led to the creation of the IEA in 1974. So we will shortly be celebrating our own 50th anniversary. And the first thing you notice when you look at the evolution of global energy supply over the last 50 years is that reduction in the share of oil. And that had a lot to do with changes that were set in motion by a period of crisis in the 1970s. The second thing that you'll notice is that we are dealing with a much larger energy system. And pretty much all of the growth that's taken place since 1973 has come from outside the OECD countries, so in emerging developing economies. Very similar situation when you look at oil demand. All of the growth since 1973 has come from emerging developing economies. And one data point that you might find interesting, back in 1973, there were around 50 million cars on the road around the world. Today, 1.3 billion. 25 times more cars on the road, but yet we've only seen a doubling in oil demand. And that speaks to some of the shifts that there have been in oil consumption between sectors in the meantime. But it's also a reminder of the importance of fuel efficiency, of efficiency policies in general, and more recently of electrification in keeping a lid on oil demand. And another theme for this presentation will be electricity and changes in the electricity mix and what that means for our energy security and climate goals. That's the shift that's taken place. We've pushed oil pretty much out of the global electricity generation mix. But the really key thing is also a question of scale. Global oil demand has doubled, but we've seen a near 6-time increase in electricity generation over the last 50 years. And that process of electrification, the importance of electricity to our lives as consumers and to our aspirations for changing the nature of the energy system towards a safer and more sustainable system, also rests very much on how that progresses over the next decades. And when we think about the changes that we're seeing in energy markets, I wanted to highlight a few structural shifts, one of which we're all thinking about: the rise of electric mobility, the increase in electric car sales around the world. Only a few years ago, 2020, 1 in every 25 cars sold worldwide was electric. This year, it's closer to 1 in 5. By the end of the decade, under today's policy settings, it'll be more like 1 in 2. So we are seeing quite a significant shift there. Of course, that's a flow. We need to be thinking about the stock as well. But with that dynamic, by the 2030s, we're also going to see an absolute reduction, in our view, in the number of internal combustion engine vehicles around the world. Likewise, big changes in the electricity generation side. 10 years ago, 70% of the world's electricity was produced with fossil fuels. Now we're closer to 60%. But there are big changes also happening there, so that by the end of this decade, we well under 50%, heading for a 40% share of fossil fuels in global electricity generation. And a third thing that we have to have in mind relates to China. China has been such an important driving force in all manner of global energy developments over recent decades. 2/3 of global oil demand growth, 1/3 of global gas demand growth. Pretty much everything that happens in coal markets has happened to some degree because of what's happening in China. But China's changing, and that will have big implications also for energy developments going forward. China is a clean energy powerhouse. Pretty much half of the wind and solar that's going to be deployed this year around the world is going to be in China. More than half of the electric vehicle sales are taking place in China, and China's growth is changing as well. That very infrastructure-led, energy-intensive model of development is changing, and so we're going to see a different quality of growth, more reliant on electricity, less reliant on some of those very energy-intensive industrial processes that produce so much steel, so much cement, as China's built out this world-class infrastructure. And as China changes, so some of the big developments in global energy change as well. So this is that push that China's given to fossil fuel demand. This is what we think China's fossil fuel future looks like under today's policy settings. And that change of tempo starts to have very significant implications for global trends, because for the first time, a scenario based on today's policy settings, we see a peak in demand for all of the fossil fuels before the end of the decade. Now, of course, there's many different moving parts there, which I won't go into now, but happy to get into later, because you've still got quite strong growth in other emerging developing economies. But the net result of all of these structural and changes is the one you're looking at on the screen. Now, some people have looked at this kind of outcome and said, well, I don't buy it. Economic growth, population growth, emerging developing economies, India, Africa, surely that's going to lead to a continued rise in demand for fossil fuels worldwide. Here's a reason why things might move even more quickly than we have in our projections, because our ability to produce clean energy technologies is expanding very rapidly. If planned manufacturing capacity comes online as the manufacturers hope, then by the end of this decade, we would be able to produce worldwide well over 1,000 gigawatts of solar PV modules each year. We're using less than half of that in the scenarios that I was just talking about. So if you were to assume a higher utilization rate of the sort that you would expect in a mature sector, for instance, 70%, then that would have further implications then for the amount of gas or the amount of coal that we would need in those scenarios. Now, you can't just talk about pushing solar into systems. You need to be doing other things as well. You need to be expanding grids. You need to be increasing your ability to operate these power systems flexibly. But this is just an indication that things could go faster than we have in those scenarios that I've just been describing. I wanted to describe also one other change in the conversation that we anticipate for the second half of this decade. Because right now, many parts of the world, the conversation about natural gas is a conversation about scarcity. It's a conversation of worries about price spikes, about security of supply. And that is going to change in our view, because we've had already quite a significant expansion in LNG supply over the last 10 years, and there's a lot of new projects that are on their way to market, primarily in the United States and in Qatar. 45, that's the equivalent of adding another 45% to the LNG supply that we have today. Now, that has multiple implications, which we can also get into during the discussion session, but one of them is that it will change the market sentiment. We will go from a situation where we are concerned about adequacy of supply to one where, frankly, we may have too much gas from a number of perspectives, but we struggled, to be honest, when we were doing this scenario work, to find a home for all of that LNG that is coming to market. This is a big bet on the idea that emerging economies in Asia will be using a lot more gas in 10 years' time than they do today. We're not 100% convinced that that's the way things are going to turn out. I wanted to say a few words also on the money that goes into the global energy sector. Roughly $1 trillion going each year into fossil fuel supply. That's been relatively stable for the last few years. And there is no scenario that we model now that sees any need for an increase in that amount. So it used to be the case pre-Paris that to balance markets in an environment where clean energy wasn't growing very fast, you needed to put more money into fossil fuels to maintain adequate supply. Of course, with significant climate implications, but that was the finding that we used to have. That's no longer the case. So I think that's something to have in mind when you hear a narrative around sort of systematic underinvestment in fossil fuels. What's changed that? What's changed that is the fact that we're now putting a whole lot more money into a range of clean energy technologies and infrastructure. And that means that by the end of this decade, in our view, we'll be investing well over $2 trillion each year in clean energy transitions. Not just renewable power, but also efficiency improvements, low emissions fuels, infrastructure, storage, all sorts of other aspects. All very encouraging. But again, that news is not good enough, because if we are to get on track for that 1.5 degree goal, then that 2 trillion would need to be well above 4. Wanted to say a couple of words about another issue which is very much on the agenda of the International Energy Agency, and that's the security of clean energy supply chains. And I'm going to illustrate that here with a look at the critical mineral supply. This is a moderately complex graph. This is a log scale, so you're moving from some very big markets to some very small ones. But what it shows is the degree of concentration in value chains for various refined commodities that go into the energy sector. If this is from 2017, if we go towards today, you see two things happen. Each of these markets is getting bigger, they're moving up the screen, but they're also moving to the right. They're becoming more concentrated. And that, for us, is a risk factor that policymakers need to be very aware of. We are seeing more diversified patterns of investment coming through in parts of Latin America, in Canada and elsewhere, but that will take time to work its way through the system. So if all of the announced projects come through, you do see some improvement to 2030, but that is still a high degree of concentration that we think and that we are working with policymakers to find solutions to. Finally, a word on the issues that we're all gathered in COP28 to discuss, the temperature implications of the work that we have done. A scenario based on the direction of travel that we see today would have a temperature rise by the end of this century of around 2.4 degrees Celsius in our view. So we've had 1.2 degrees of rise since pre-industrial times in global average surface temperatures, and we're already seeing very stark implications of that. And here we have another 1.2. So we need to be doing a whole lot more to get us down towards that net zero emissions by 2050 scenario and a 1.5 degree stabilization in the rise in global average temperatures. Now, that stated policy scenario, it does see a peak in global energy-related CO2 emissions in the next few years. But we still emit, we still accumulate CO2 in the atmosphere, we still face a rising trajectory for global temperatures. This is the agenda that we think is so important for policymakers here. Of course, we're focusing only on the energy-related aspects of this, but this is what we feel would mark a successful COP28. We're all aware of the discussions around a tripling of renewables. I think we have to have in mind there that this is not just a story about generation. We have to be focusing on the infrastructure side as well, batteries, grids, and so on. Doubling in the rate of improvement of efficiency. We have to talk about fossil fuels. I think we have to recognize that bringing down global emissions also means bringing down global demand for oil, for natural gas, for coal. We cannot just focus on CO2. We have to think carefully about what more can be done to relieve the pressures on near-term warming by dramatic reductions in methane emissions. And there, I think there are some hopeful elements that have come through over the last few days as well. But the enabler for all of this is the one in the last column. There is a huge deficit of clean energy projects coming through in emerging developing economies outside China, where we haven't seen that pickup in spending that has been characterized, that we've seen in many other parts of the world. Now, of course, there are bright spots there, you know, solar in India, I mean, wind investments in Brazil, and so on. But broadly speaking, we still don't have that momentum behind clean energy transitions in most emerging and developing economies that we would need to get us onto a different pathway. I will leave things there. I'm, as always, very happy to have such a distinguished panel to react to some of these findings, and of course interested to hear views from everyone joined here today as well. Ah, sorry, I missed a click. There we are.
Tripling.
All right. Sirin, back to you.
I'm such a disaster. Thank you, Tim. Thank you so much, Tim. Now we can move then to our esteemed panel. Let me call on Mr. Thiago Barral, Secretary of Energy Planning and Transition from the Ministry of Mines and Energy of Brazil. Welcome. Then I would like to welcome Mr. Jean-Denis Charlebois, Chief Economist from the Canada Energy Regulator, and Mr. Jason Bordoff, Founding Director of the Center on Global Energy Policy from Columbia University. Welcome. So our colleague Tim just gave a presentation of the World Energy Outlook, this global vision on, based on different scenarios where the world should go and could go by 2030. What are the requirements? Just to stay on this global overview, I would like to start with the first question for Mr. Jason to give insights on how we can further enhance global collaboration, because, of course, this is something that is really key to make possible the tripling of energy, of renewable energy, doubling of energy efficiency, tripling the amount of investments in the emerging and developing countries. So yes, please, if you could react for a few minutes on these, and also on the evolving geopolitical context that is also impacting the outlook.
Great. Thank you so much for putting this session together, for the invitation to be here with my friend Tim. Just such a wealth of knowledge, trying to make one's way through the World Energy Outlook year after year, and it's such a tremendous resource that you provide to help all of us who try to understand these issues better. one of the points that is made, there are a lot of important points when you wade your way through hundreds and hundreds of pages, that Tim and his really fantastic team make in the World Energy Outlook this year, is how the context, how the global context is changing for this outlook. One is the accelerated pace of investment in clean energy, so not nearly enough, but this, roughly double investment in clean energy versus fossil fuels. The idea that all three fossil fuels individually would peak by the end of the year. This is a very different outlook than one would have seen 10 years ago. You noted, sort of keep this in mind when people talk about the risk of underinvestment in fossil fuels. We don't need as much investment. Even the IEA, not many years ago, was warning of the risk of underinvestment, and that changed outlook for demand for fossil fuels, driven by the consequent change in investment in clean energy, which is what helps drive demand down, is a huge shift. The IEA also notes that there's a broader changed landscape, one of greater, not less, geopolitical risk, a new era of great power rivalry, where forces of competition, as much as cooperation, are driving a lot of the trends in the energy sector. The Inflation Reduction Act in my own country was driven as much by economic competition with China as by the kind of cooperation one hopes is taking place in the backdrop here with negotiators at a place like COP. So there's a new landscape of geopolitical tensions that remind us of why we should move much faster to a clean energy future, which is not only one about the threat of climate change, but can be one that enhances energy security, but can make it harder to get to that future as well if we don't navigate those forces. The IEA makes very clear that while a decarbonized world will be one that is much more electrified, electricity tends to be less traded across borders, so overall energy-related trade is much lower. That can enhance energy security. We need a dramatic increase in global trade in clean energy products and technologies. And if every country tries to, through industrial strategy, or tariffs or protectionism or forces of economic fragmentation, tries to build all clean energy supply activity at home, that's going to make it more expensive and harder to have the transition we need. So there's a changing geopolitical backdrop that is happening right now. New forces of industrial policy. There's especially coming out of the energy crisis in Europe just a few years ago. Again, what we saw, I can say more about with the Inflation Reduction Act in my own country. We saw, Tim mentioned how, the energy crisis, the IEA was born out of the crisis of 50 years ago, just almost to the day, the Arab oil embargo, where you saw iconic lines at the gas station, and those were driven not only by Arab members of OPEC that cut off supply, but by actually bad policy. We had government micromanaging energy markets, we had price controls, we had a complex allocation system, and then you had many decades of government pulling itself out of the energy sector in many respects, not all. It still plays a very big role. That trend is being reversed. Governments around the world, broadly speaking, are inserting themselves more into how we think about the energy sector, and that can help accelerate a transition, but has to be done really carefully as well. The new era of a higher cost of capital that you talked about is going to have huge potential implications for the energy system. And then the WEO, of course, notes that the impacts of climate change themselves are a growing threat to energy security. Drought that makes it harder for vessels to cross the Panama Canal, heat waves that make it harder for the grid to operate. So the potential, we're now thinking about energy security as well as climate change, especially after the last couple of years, and that's a good thing. A world that is lower carbon can and will be one that is much more energy secure, but there are potential risks to energy security and how we get from here to there. A more electrified world might be more exposed to cybersecurity risk. I think in the last WEO, you noted that flexibility was the new watchword of energy security, because we're going to have a grid that's going to have to handle much more intermittent forms of energy, and we have to make sure we can navigate that. The critical minerals concentration you mentioned. So there are new energy security risks that the clean energy economy poses. We need to think about those today, the same way the IEA was created to think about the risks of oil and gas, so we can navigate them, de-risk the energy transition to make sure we move forward with the scale and speed we need.
Thank you so much. Let me then pass the floor to Mr. Charlebois, if you would like to react on what Mr. Jason just shared in terms of this global overview and how it applies also to Canada.
Yes, thank you. In terms of the global geopolitical climate, I won't add much to what Tim and Jason mentioned. I think they covered the topic very efficiently. What I'll do, though, is build upon that context that directly impacts Canada in terms of a small open economy that has a very progressive climate agenda, as well as being in the top 5, top 6 oil and gas producers in the world. So that creates a...
She's telling you to bring it.
that creates a very interesting dynamic that is worth studying, and we rely extensively on the foundational work of the IEA to inform our modeling as it relates to the global context. And what we see is that from an oil and gas production perspective, Canada is able to maintain its market share, its current market share, despite the projection of much lower oil and gas prices into the future. And that is being achieved through improved processes, efficiencies from producers, as well as the use of carbon capture and storage across a number of sectors. And that is actually a reflection of not only the geology in Canada, but also something that we did not discuss up to now is the production of hydrogen, which is something that the Canadian energy system will rely extensively, both from a transportation perspective as well as heavy industries relying on that clean fuel to power the system. Now, a word about the electricity system. We see demand to more than double in Canada to 2050, which is, I think, a pace of growth that is somewhat smaller than what the IEA sees globally. And that is, I think, because of the fact that Canada starts from a position of somewhat greater electrification compared to some other economies. But that creates quite of a challenge in terms of developing or deploying the renewable generation capacity that is required, mostly from wind, not as much solar as the IEA sees globally, but that's a reflection of the peaking nature of the Canadian electricity system, as well as the availability of the wind resource. So I'll pause here, making sure my colleague from Brazil has time, and happy to continue to engage with the discussion.
Thank you so much. Yeah, indeed. And then we can move to Brazil with another context, energy context, other priorities. And I would like to hear more precisely also on how you feel the country should, on which policies and technologies the country should leverage in order to be on this trend towards the clean energy development, and also to be a key actor in keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius open.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for having me here. Well, I think Brazil has three main elements that make us a very interesting country and a very promising country when it comes to contributing to the energy transition. First of all, Brazil has actually a long-standing tradition of policies towards clean energy, renewable energies, and probably the same reason for the creation of the IEA. So, for example, the biofuel program in Brazil has a lot to do with the oil shocks as well. So that is something that Brazil has. We've had a number of policies in the past that have been sustained over the time, have been adapted, improved along the time. And a new set of policies also being announced and developed. So, for example, the Fuel of the Future program being pushed forward by the government to establish mandates starting 2027 for sustainable aviation fuels in domestic flights, and also mandates for green diesel blending starting 2027. Another example is the hydrogen program, also for example, multiplying sevenfold investment in R&D and innovation for hydrogen. So another example that is very critical, the transmission plan, investment plan. We are basically doubling the pace of deployment of grid infrastructure, and we've had this year the biggest transmission auction so far in the history of Brazil. In next week, we're having the second biggest one, and in March next year, another record high transmission auction, enabling 3 times more deployment of renewable generation. So these are some of the examples. And just to close on the policy side, we are also, for example, in the Amazon region, the isolated systems, it's less than 1% of the electricity market, but it's basically fully dependent on diesel generation. So this is like a last mile effort that really pays off, replacing with renewable and storage and so on. But more than this long-standing tradition of renewable energy policies and this new set of policies, Brazil is and Latin America in general, is a very resource-rich region. Brazil has amazing, outstanding wind and solar resources, hydropower, biomass production and sustainably certificated biomass production, uranium to sustain a new nuclear momentum. So this is also part of, and minerals as well, lithium and a number of other minerals that are critical for the energy transition. And the third, I think, aspect that makes Brazil an interesting and very promising country in the energy transition is the institutional framework and capacities. Brazil has an energy planning office. Brazil has very well-established regulatory agencies of electricity, oil, gas, and biofuels. So I think this is a combination that makes Brazil very well positioned to play a leadership role in the energy transition.
Thank you so much, Thiago. And indeed, you've mentioned many of the success stories in Brazil that are also serving for inspiration to other countries, for instance, the institutional framework and the biofuel program. I'd like just to add another general question on, before opening the floor to the audience, how to make sure that a lot of things will happen, but how to make sure this transition is people-centered. And if you could just react, and I would like to hear also from colleague from Canada and as well as Jason on the same. Yes, please.
I can
you
start.
Have the mic.
So this is a very, very important question and point. Let me. Well, we're talking about and the World Energy Outlook shows us the need for speeding up the deployment of clean energy infrastructure so that we can phase down oil demand and fossil demand. So this is a very clear message. But once we speed up the deployment of wind, solar, transmission, bioenergy, hydrogen, that has an impact on the territory, that has an impact on people, and we are seeing that happen more often in Brazil. As we scale up the deployment of clean energy infrastructure, particularly grid infrastructure, wind and solar, we have seen rising concerns and complaints from local communities. So it's a global issue, climate change, but it ends up also on the local layer of all this transformation. And we are now creating a national forum for energy transition, bringing more civil society to discuss how can we do that in a democratic way, with a participatory process. So that takes time, but how can we combine all of that into a speeding up all the deployment? So this is a critical aspect. I have no clear answers for that. We are trying to build consensus on those topics, but that's going to be a huge challenge moving ahead. And if you allow me just to acknowledge all the Brazil is part of the IEA family as a association country, and we really appreciate all the work done. And we are trying to also develop net zero scenarios for our own region, go into more specific aspects of the region. And I think South America and Brazil will have to accommodate in these scenarios huge amount of mining and clean energy infrastructure. So we must take care of that, do that in a just and inclusive way. And that means also, well, that has many implications, as you can imagine.
Thank you so much. Indeed, it's not an easy topic. There is no clear answer, but as long as the process is inclusive and there is a will to be really inclusive and look at the needs of different communities that are impacted by the transition, the outcome will be positive in any case.
If I may just add a compliment. Brazil has just started its presidency of the G20 group, and one of the 3 priorities in the energy transitions track is the social dimension of the energy transition. So we really look forward to engaging all of you on, let's say, providing new meanings to this discussion, because at the beginning it was all very much focused on how to manage jobless people, people going jobless because of phasing out coal or so. And in the case of Brazil, this discussion is very much how can we manage the impact of clean energy infrastructure on local communities.
Thank you so much. Mr. Charlebois.
Yeah, so I will echo the importance of community engagement that my colleague just mentioned. This is very fundamental into the work that the Canada Energy Regulator does, as well as the work of the federal government in general in Canada. Over and above the need to meaningfully engage communities, as we navigate a transition, energy modelers like our team and people here on the panel will tend to focus on economic aspects as well as technological aspects of the pathways to net zero, and this is what we have focused on ourselves in developing 2 particular pathways for Canada to net zero to 2050. And I think the next step in the conversation is to provide more granularity in terms of the costs of the transition, both at the macro level for countries as well as the micro level for households. This is something that is top of mind for energy consumers, ratepayers across the energy system. And I think there is a great appetite to provide more transparency because we hear areas where costs might actually decrease and from an operational perspective, but there's always an upfront and new investment cost that need to be factored into. The other aspect I will mention is one of the need to have the institutional framework to enable the transition in an efficient way. The role of regulation, the role also of other policy imperatives, such as something that is very important in Canada, is the reconciliation with Indigenous people, so that they can be not only meaningfully engaged through the evaluation process of energy projects, but also into participation into owning energy projects of their own through the energy transition, which will require from policymakers, regulators, and other stakeholders, the banking system, for example, to rethink the way things have been done so far to make sure that the transition is actually inclusive for all stakeholders and all communities.
Thank you so much. Now let me give the floor for the final word to Jason Bordoff to conclude.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked about this topic. It's incredibly important, and there are so many aspects to what a just and equitable transition looks like. Part of it are communities that may be impacted by clean energy, by mining, and actually Canada, I think, provides a good example, which I've looked carefully at, on free, prior, and informed consent, how to engage with tribal and Indigenous communities. But to see a dramatic increase in mining within the United States, you look at nickel, copper, something around 80–90% of the known reserves are within 35 miles of a Native American reservation, just given where the geography is in the United States. It is also the reason I asked Tim to click on his last piece of a slide was because that I was interested, but I kind of knew what direction in order of magnitude it would be, but how important that point is. The last little thing you clicked on was investment in emerging and developing economies. And we really have to do a much better job of taking seriously the need for energy use to grow, even with as many measures of efficiency as we can, and how dramatic the increase in investment in clean energy has to be. in lower income parts of the world that use a tiny fraction of what we all take for granted. Sub-Saharan Africa, the US uses per capita about 80 times the average per capita energy use in Sub-Saharan Africa. Emerging and developing economies are 2/3 of the world's population. And you showed us, I think, 2 trillion last year in clean energy investment. In the developing world, I think it was about 1/10 that amount. Was going into emerging and developing economies, and you showed us it needs to go from 200 or 250 billion to 1 trillion by 2030 to be on track for our climate goals. Renewables are often the cheapest form of energy, certainly with some government support, but there are a number of barriers that make it more challenging to invest in emerging and developing economies, where the cost of capital can be 5, 6, 7 times higher than we think it is for investment firms. Many of them are here at this COP, who are putting capital to work in the US or in Europe or in more developed economies. Currency exchange risk is one we've worked quite a bit on at the Center on Global Energy Policy and trying to think creatively about new mechanisms and facilities that could be created with multilateral development institutions, with philanthropic capital, with governments to mitigate currency exchange risk. But there are many barriers that make it more challenging to invest in scaling clean energy at the rate we need to make sure that the developing world and the emerging markets have not just the energy that's needed for energy access, as it is today, about what, 800 million people have no energy access. The last couple of years that number's been going up, not down, headed in the wrong direction. But even that number doesn't really take seriously the number of people, billions around the world, who will use more energy for significant economic growth, to not just have energy access like charging cell phones or light bulbs, but mechanizing agriculture in some form of industry, the air conditioning, which is going to be more in need. And we're just talking about the investment that's needed for clean energy, not even to cope with the impacts of climate change. And so it was wonderful to see the agreement on day one on loss and damage. And we should recognize that was what, $400 million? The floods in Pakistan alone last year were $30 billion in damages. So the scale of impacts that we are going to see are really quite staggering, and we're just nowhere close to having the amount of finance that it's going to need to take seriously developing a clean energy economy, allowing for economic growth in the lower income parts of the world, and coping with the impacts of climate change.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bordoff, and thank you for expanding more and emphasizing the need for greater amounts of investments and developing world emerging economies in low-income countries, mainly in Africa, because this is, as you rightly mentioned, is a matter of survival and economic development for these countries. So, with that, I would like to open now the floor to the audience for a few questions, including to my colleague Tim, if you have questions on the presentation or.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Takachogo, Mitsui Global Strategic Studies Institute. I'm an economist. And yes, my question is Brazilian colleague. So this COP, one of the surprise and very impressive thing for me is many side event road to Brazil. So that is one of the interesting for me. But today we discuss about the climate and energy security. So in my understanding about the situation of Brazil, so the hydropower are affected by the climate change or extreme weather, I'm not sure. But also you commented on use of bioenergy. But also by drought, maybe the bioproduction would be heavily affected. So how do you think about climate change and energy security balance in Brazil? I think this kind of the format will be applied to another country as well, including Canada or other things. So just my question.
Please feel free to take the
Okay,
question.
so yeah, this is a new dimension of energy planning in Brazil that has grown a lot of attention in the past few years. 3 years ago, Brazil faced the worst drought ever in its history, and it was quite a challenge to overcome it. Now, the past 2 years, Brazil has had maybe some of the biggest floods in 100 years. So it's been quite challenging again. And while we speak here, the Amazon region is facing the worst drought in in as far as I'm concerned, 100 years. Rivers are dry. It's something that we could not even think of. So it makes it so there's a number modeling and analysis on how to increase resilience of the energy systems. How we do that, we need more grids to bring more flexibility, and that's something we are doing. We need to adjust the, let's say, the risk aversion criteria. Also, that means that we need to operate the system, the power system, in a more conservative way to ensure a more resilient, more resilience in managing the energy stocks. But when it comes to bioenergy, again, that's another challenge. So we need to diversify, and our key strategy for resilience is diversification. We have bioenergy, we have renewables, we have natural gas, and we need to combine that and create a hybrid system that tries to balance that. And finally, we are moving towards, this is quite a tough process, but that's something that needs to be done, increasing interconnection and increasing integration with neighboring and other areas, other regions. So we are, for example, working to integrate Brazil with Bolivia, something that has not been done. We are increasing integration with Argentina and Uruguay on a number of regulatory measures that are enabling increasing trade, electricity trade. But you're right, I mean, this is quite a challenge. And whenever we increase renewables, renewables by definition are variable and subject to climate and so on. So the most complicated thing is how to explain and how to demonstrate the economic optimum from a system perspective and from an asset perspective. So this is something that there's growing understanding, but I think we still have a huge road ahead on this topic.
Thank you so much. Mr. Charlebois, Mr. Jason, would like to react, or?
I'll just say two comments. That's fascinating about how Brazil is facing similar challenges as Canada, and you've touched on the very points that are live right now. The only thing I'll add is that with the greater deployment of renewables, what the need that we see in Canada is to obviously maintain the availability of baseload power. And in a context where the hydroelectricity resources has largely been used with the existing dams, then we need to turn to increase the generation capacity from the nuclear sector. And that aspect requires deep community engagement to make sure that there's buy-in from local communities for small modular reactors, for example, that are not actually part of the energy landscape as we speak. The other aspect is that Canada also relies less and less actually on gas-fired power generation. And as we move on the pathway to net zero, this will require, in some regions of Canada, the use of carbon capture and storage, along with existing gas power fire generation, which is a technology that, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is key for the electricity generation sector, and also for hydrogen production, and to the extent that it can generate net negative emissions to offset emissions from other sectors that remain more challenging to abate. So, resiliency, fundamentally important, obviously, and I think relying on a broad portfolio of technologies to make sure that we maintain that resiliency and also drive towards net zero is a key part of the equation.
Thank you so much. I'm informed that we are expecting to welcome the Minister Ebba from Sweden from 1 minute to another, but meanwhile, I think we can continue with the discussion. And sorry, from the.
Yes, if I may continue just for a second. My name is Peter Molgaard. I'm the chair of the Danish Council on Climate Change.
Could you speak
closer?
A bit louder, please?
All right. I'm Peter Molgaard, the chair of the Danish Council on Climate Change. We made a report half a year ago on electrification and more renewables into the Danish energy system, which of course already has a lot of renewables. So more wind and more solar. And we simulated the system until 2040 and tried to stretch it in terms of all kinds of weather events, but also you could say acts of terrorism, and see how resilient it would be. And the result is actually quite good, I think. And what we found was that we can, with relatively little backup technologies, with strong interconnectors, I must say, now we're talking about Nordic cooperation with our Nordic countries and also Germany and the Netherlands, but also with relatively small investments in backup technologies such as gas furnaces. We could have a resilient system with a very high degree of security. So we did not need to have nuclear power for that. That would actually be a very expensive solution in order to support that system. Gas furnaces would be much better, and interconnectors. So maybe you could comment, so that's the question, whether you mentioned trade in energy, and that would go down. Our experience is that it could actually go up if you think of interconnectors, and maybe that's part of the solution.
Would like to take it, Tim?
I think Denmark is an extremely interesting case there, because the share of emissions coming from electricity in Denmark, that was up at 30-40% not so long ago. Now it's down below 10%, if I'm not mistaken. And the achievement there means that Denmark is already sort of pioneering some new technologies that are needed for the more difficult areas and the issues that arise as you push electrification through the system. I think Denmark has benefited as an importer of flexibility from its neighbors, and that has facilitated some of the changes that have moved very, very quickly there. And in a strongly interconnected system like the European single market, that, of course, people feel comfortable with that. And there are occasionally still strains, but people generally feel comfortable with that level of integration. I think Europe is, unfortunately, the exception there. And that the degree of trust that exists within Europe for that is unfortunately not mirrored in many other parts of the world, despite many efforts in ASEAN, for example, with the ASEAN power grid, or in Africa with regional power pools. You haven't seen that degree of trust, because in the end, for such an important commodity like electricity, it's very rare to find countries that feel very comfortable importing, because it seems risky somehow. So our scenarios rely, when we think about moving large quantities of electricity around the world, we tend to see those embedded in electricity-intensive goods. And that might be, or products, it could be hydrogen, in the case of hydrogen produced through electrolysis, or it could be aluminium, or it could be other very electricity-intensive processes. So those advantages that some countries have for renewable electricity tend to express themselves in other ways than through direct export of electricity. But of course, that is our judgment call, and we wait to see, if that's the way it plays out.
I would just add, I think, tell me if you agree, Tim, part of that is about trust with neighbors, but also what's different about electricity versus hydrocarbons. So if you're import dependent on oil or gas and there's a disruption in supply, as Europe learned, you can turn to a global LNG market, or you can hold weeks or months of inventory with refined petroleum products. That's much harder to do with electricity. So you may be comfortable depending on your neighbors, but if there were significant amounts of electricity imported from North Africa into Europe or in the parts of the world you're talking about, where the grid has to be perfectly balanced every second of every day, I think that poses energy security risks that could be even more difficult to manage unless the grid is highly interconnected to other players. Oh, absolutely. This is not a reason not to decarbonize much faster and not to electrify the economy. The IEA, I think, in their net zero report found global energy-related trade in the net zero scenario falls about 60%, something like that. And I think that's part of the reason why, right? Increased electrification.
No, exactly. Nothing that I've just said should take away anything from the importance of robust grids, and where possible, balancing over a large geographical area, because the broader the geographical area you can balance over, the easier it is to manage the flexibility needs of a system. And, I mean, Brazil's, again, because it's a large country with diverse resources across its territory, that balancing works across Brazil. It works even better if you can interconnect with some neighbors, as Thiago was saying. But I'm just saying that is a complicated thing to get to work. And there's many examples around the world of quite how complicated some of those negotiations can be.
Thank you so much. I think we can take another question.
Hello, my name is Mario Motta. I'm working for the Department of Energy of Politecnico di Milano. It's a university in Italy. Thanks for the presentation. I had let's say, in a time where it's not clear if in the last declaration of this conference there will be the fading out of fossil fuels written there. The figures that you showed are pretty impressive. So, I mean, a peak for the fossils and makes hope, let's say, in a good direction. My question was, mainly one thing that I see which is risky, and I wanted a comment from you, is that the big things there are that there is an extreme overproduction of photovoltaics in China, and a continuous concentration of battery production in China as well. And so I was wondering whether you can comment on the risk of that and on the effects that this could have, not on the global market, but on the access to energy or the potential development towards decarbonization of the countries which gain access to cheap energy with that photovoltaics.
So there's a lot of elements in there. I mean, certainly from an IEA perspective, when we look at the manufacturing capacity for solar PV around the world, and we look at how relatively little of it we use in that stated policy scenario, that looks like a huge opportunity. In an open, rules-based international system, there should be ways to bring that to countries that are looking to expand their renewable or use more of their renewable potential. But the fact is, for the moment, there aren't that many big markets for deploying solar. I mean, there's North America, and North America, or the US at least, is not an open place for Chinese solar PV modules. There's Europe, but let's look at places you can expand. People often say, well, what about Africa? Right now, the solar PV deployment in Belgium is larger than the installed solar capacity in the whole of Africa. This is not a huge solar market. It should be a massive solar market, but it isn't. And so when you're thinking about places where some of the solar PV modules could go, it's not obvious that there are big open markets there that have the policies in place, that have the financing in place. But it is a huge opportunity, I think, to go beyond the status quo for many countries. Now, as you also rightly point out, that comes with concerns. That comes with concerns about the concentration in clean energy supply chains, because you're completely correct that particularly for solar, there's an extremely high degree of concentration of solar, of all aspects of solar PV manufacturing in China. And China PV modules are just twice as cheap as the ones produced in the US or the ones that are produced in the EU. It's very difficult to go head-to-head with the Chinese manufacturers in an environment when they have already overcapacity. So this is a delicate issue, and finding that balance between having access to the least cost source of that technology and looking at the resilience of your supply chains is not a simple matter at all. But there are, for different technologies, policies now in place that will help to rebalance a little bit that equation. So take batteries, for example. China currently produces about 75% of the world's EV batteries. There are a lot of new projects underway in the US, for example, as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. There are investments that are taking place in other parts of the world. Car manufacturers are looking to source their own critical mineral supply and start to get more of that supply chain under their own management. if all of those projects come through, we will move from 75% Chinese production to something like 65% by the end of this decade. So a change, but we shouldn't imagine that that change is going to be quick or dramatic, even with the very strong policy momentum that we have for sort of industrial strategies in many parts of the world.
Thank you so much, Tim. Now it's our great pleasure to welcome Her Excellency, Minister Ebba Busch, Minister for Energy, Business and Industry. Your Excellency, welcome. Sorry. Yeah, we don't need it. Let me hold it.
Thank you, and thank you so much for letting me be part of this event. I was just running from another event with huge focus on renewables and a global commitment in tripling the production of renewable power sources as well. But I would like to start these closing remarks by thanking the IEA and the Nordic Energy Research for the opportunity to close this event in the Nordic Pavilion. And of course, start by thanking the IEA for the focus it has provided on improving energy security and also on measures needed to put the energy sector on the path to limiting global warming. I believe that your analysis they have made us better prepared for this winter. However, we cannot settle on our achievements. Uncertainties from the conflicts and a very volatile global economy means that we still have to remain prepared. However, I'd like to see the good things in the bad things, and despite the global uncertainty, I still would say that it was a pleasure to read some of the key findings in the World Energy Outlook. Number one that I take with me is that the door to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is still open. There is still hope. The second part that I take with me is that for the very first time, we will actually be able to witness a peak and hence the start of a decline in the use of fossil fuels before 2030. A peak use in my ears is not a positive thing, but this actually marks a turning point. And I'm also grateful to Dr. Birol and the IEA for stepping up and instantly providing analysis and guidance from this. You play a key role for international cooperation on energy and climate, and you also play a key role in our policy development. We therefore are eager to get our hands on the in-depth review of Sweden this summer, and I believe more countries share that same eagerness. The Swedish government is committed to put forward measures to strengthen security of supply and to reach net zero emissions by 2045. That is 5 years ahead of most countries. However, that target, as I guess many of you already have figured out, will require extensive electrification of the industry and transport sectors, which is expected to double our electricity consumption by 2045. To be able to manage this in only 2 decades and at the same time then managing or maintaining competitive prices requires massive investments in a robust and stable electricity system that delivers fossil-free electricity where and when it is needed, not only when it wants to. So we will need to integrate more electricity from renewables. Yes, we're super committed to that. We're the #1 country within the European Union that has the most renewables already today. But we will also need more nuclear to stabilize power grids and to facilitate a broader uptake of wind and solar. So in the case of Sweden, if we want more wind, if we want more solar into our system, we're going to need more nuclear. Because that's fossil-free baseload, and we need them to work together. For the past 10 years, Sweden has connected 10,000 megawatts of intermittent renewable energy. That's the equivalent of 7 reactors, nuclear reactors that is. During the same time, 4 nuclear reactors have been closed. And because of this, our system has become more fragile than ever. So the nuclear renaissance that we have experienced these recent years show that more and more are coming to the same conclusion that we have drawn. If you want the opportunity of realistically reaching net zero sooner, quicker, faster, better, then you also need that fossil-free baseload to work together with the intermittent power sources. So before I finish, I would like to say that we look very much forward to taking over the presidency of the Nordic Council of Ministers in 2024 and leading the cooperation forward, a safer, a greener, a freer Nordic region. That will be the focus of the Swedish presidency, and our vision is that the Nordic region should be the world's most integrated and sustainable region in 2030. In specifically the energy area, Sweden plans to pay particular attention to electricity market cooperation and electrification. And as you've already understood, as Deputy Prime Minister with special responsibility for energy, I'm looking forward to next year. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for your remarks. Unfortunately, I'm told that Dr. Birol will be unable to join us for his closing remarks. He's been caught in another meeting. So let me thank again our esteemed panel for this great discussion. I hope we'll have some few minutes for broader engagement and other exchanges of views after this event. Otherwise, I guess you will meet in other events during COP. And with that, we come to the end of this presentation, and maybe see you next year for the 2024.